Keely was anxiously pacing the hallway of the main care home building. The doorbell rang and muttering, "About time!" under her breath, she rushed to the main door and opened it.
What you ringing the doorbell for?
Her relief turned to apprehension. It was not the expected return of Aaron, but the unexpected sight of 2 police officers that stopped her cold. The security jeep slowed to crawl as it passed the crashed minivan labeled clearly Janeth's Garage and Shop. Harris wound his window down and studied the damaged van. Black leaned over from the passenger seat.
Quite effective research, man.
He smiled.
You're enjoying this way too much. It's meant to defend against hostile forces, not murder innocent people.
Harris eyed Black with disgust. God, how much of a douche was this man. He had a mind to say something, but thought better.
Collateral damage, man.
Black said heartlessly.
Moral delusions cause doubt, hesitation, and mistakes.
You're all heart.
And you're a pussy, man.
Yeah, and fuck you too.
It can't be far away. This has only recently been done.
Harris gunned the jeep. Jody sat at the care home dining table, taking notes. Ray, arms crossed, leant against the wall.
You say your colleague has gone to check on your children for you,
said Jody.
Yes, but he should be back any time,
Keely said nervously. Ray stood up straight and tried his best comforting smile.
Where do you live, love?
Jody glared at Ray, mouthing, "Love?" At him, Ray ignored her.
I'll go and check on your kids and see if I can find him. If he left when you said he should be back by now.
Probably got lost in the fog knowing him.
She laughed nervously.
Yes, I'm sure there's nothing to worry about,
Jody interjected.
Don't worry, Jody will stay here with you.
Jody gave Ray another glare. He ignored her again.
Won't you, Jody?
Jody finally stopped glaring at Ray and smiled at the ever more troubled Keely.
Yes, of course I will.
Jody shot imaginary daggers into the back of the leaving Ray and turned to the agitated Keely.
He'll be okay, you know,
she reassured.
I hope so,
replied Keely.
How long were you married?
Keely's face dropped.
Oh, I don't give a shit about him. I stopped caring about that twat a long time ago. It's Aaron and my kids I'm worried about. Well, my kids mostly.
Jody envied her a little, that close mother and child bond, that unconditional love that was absent in her life. A boyfriend she tolerated and another empty yearning for her ex was all she had, and her job, of course, but tonight that had lost its charm, stuck with the Ray the pig.
They'll be okay,
she said, referring to Keely's children.
They're probably tucked up in bed right at this very moment.
Keely couldn't help worrying her daughter. She was a good girl, but she was still her little girl in her eyes, even though at 15 she had just about outgrown her. Keely couldn't help fretting. Jody noticed.
It's been one of those nights,
she said, trying to comfort her. Keely nodded in agreement.
Strange about the power going, the phones and the thickness of the fog all at once. Synchronicity.
The sound of the same bizarre, eerie rattling began to creep through the open window of the hallway, low, quiet, distant to begin with, but slowly, very slowly increasing in volume. Jody noticed it first.
Can you hear that?
The rattling began to fade away again. Jensen Harris parked the Jeep in an improvised parking place along the narrow country road. He kept the motor running as Norman Black, motion tracker in hand, tranquilizer rifle in the other, strode out a few yards in front of the Jeep and scanned the area for signs of significant movement.
Well?
Harris was getting impatient. At that moment, the motion tracker began to bleep. Black paced backwards towards the Jeep, smiling.
Got it.
He jumped back in the Jeep, and Harris immediately gunned the aging military vehicle in the direction of the signal and disappeared into the thick blanket of fog. At the petrol station, Wayne had become ever more anxious, his facial expressions highlighted by the dim light of the battery lantern placed on the till point desk. Tony had tried his best to put the boy at ease. He had suggested walking Wayne home on more than one occasion, but Wayne had stubbornly declined, stating each time that he wanted to wait to see when his father returned, and clinging to the hope his dad's white pickup van would once again emerge from the fog and onto the garage forecourt. Tony watched as Wayne's nervous tics and his autistic traits gave an insight into boys' levels of apprehension. But when his fidgeting abruptly stopped and Wayne suddenly became alert and focused, Tony couldn't help wondering if Wayne's senses were somehow more finely tuned than normal.
What's wrong, Wayne?
Tony asked curiously. Wayne didn't answer. He was transfixed. It was then that Tony heard the same bizarre rattling sound that had preceded Janet's entrance earlier that night. An almost trance-like Wayne drifted towards the tradesman entrance at the far end of the shop. In the darkness, he stood and listened to the rattling almost as if it was communicating to Wayne personally. The sound gradually increased in volume as its source seemed to drift closer.
Do you know what that is, Wayne?
Tony approached the silent, transfixed Wayne and nudged him.
Wayne.
Wayne slowly turned his head towards Tony, but the blank, cold stare on his face began to freak Tony out.
You okay?
Wayne turned back towards the direction of the sound. It again appeared to be right outside the door.
I hear that sound a lot when I take the dog for a walk near the old airbase.
Do you know what it is?
Tony said. Wayne shook his head. Still clutching the lantern, Tony extracted the shop keys from his pocket and began to slowly unlock the staff door. Wayne swiftly grabbed Tony's arm. Tony glanced at Wayne and smiled nervously.
It's most likely just Janet again.
He wasn't overly convinced himself, but he wasn't going to let the boy know that. Tony slowly opened the door, and cold air rushed in. The fog drifted in through the doorway, and Wayne stared blankly into the blackness beyond, the rattle ever more louder, real and tangible, without the barrier of the door, unnatural and sinister in its manner. Tony, holding the lantern out in front of him, edged out over the threshold and into the darkness. Wayne stayed rooted to the spot, even when Tony fleetingly disappeared into the unerring fog. Within moments, he hastily reappeared, slammed shut the door, and locked it. The speed and immediacy of his actions belied his age and had none of his usual relaxed demeanor. Tony was spooked, badly spooked.
I think it would be better to make your way home, Wayne. Lock the door and wait for your dad there.
There was a quiver in his voice, a nervousness that made Wayne uneasy.
Why?
Wayne asked. The door shuddered with a loud bang as something substantial the other side of the door crashed into it, and again a loud bang, and the heavy wooden door cracked. Wayne started to shake uncontrollably.
Wayne, come with me, and when I say run, you run, okay?
Tony quickly ushered Wayne to the other end of the shop, grabbed a key from a hook, a steel tubular hook that could open the forecourt manhole covers, some rags, a lighter, and a heavy set of hand pliers. Wayne, bemused and panicking, started to become very agitated.
What?
Don't worry, Wayne, you just stay behind me, and when I say run, you run as fast as you can and don't stop till you get home. You understand me?
Wayne nodded. The garage forecourt was originally designed in the 1970s and had underground tanks that could be accessed from manhole covers in the ground. Each tank had a padlocked round metal cover that was removed so fresh deliveries of fuel could be fed into the underground tanks using nothing more than tubes from the tanker and gravity. This meant when the round metal covers were removed, there was nothing between the fuel in the tank and the surface, and therefore extremely dangerous and flammable to naked flames or soaked rags set alight and dropped down the tube, a process that could not only set alight the fuel in the underground tank, but cause a significant explosion. At least that's what Tony was hoping. It was noticeably colder in the chill of the night air, and Tony shivered, but whether it was from the cold or the ramifications of his intended actions, he did not know or care. Wayne followed like a lost puppy and did, as Tony had suggested, and stayed right behind the forecourt attendant. He was becoming very agitated.
What's going on, Tony?
He said, hopping from one foot to the other. Tony didn't reply. His mind was racing as he lifted the manhole cover of the biggest tank of unleaded fuel and placed it next to him on the ground. By this time, the bizarre, unnerving rattling had moved from behind the back of the building and was now, by the sound of things, about 15 or so meters out in front of them and getting closer. It was hard to tell for sure. Visibility was still only a few feet at best. Tony dropped to his knees, unlocked the padlock, loosened the lid fasteners, and popped open the steel conduit leading to the tank. The dark, ominous shape was close, really close now, and the rattle was increasingly intense.
Are you ready, Wayne?
Tony, still on his knees, took one of the rags, tied it to the pliers, and set a light to it. The shape emerged from the fog, its huge mandibles dripping in blood, an organic killing machine of man's worst nightmares.
Now!
Yelled Tony, but Wayne had not needed telling. He was gone. The sheer terror had seen to that. The mutation, its eyes cold and black and its stench putrid, had sensed Wayne's movement and reacted, giving chase. Tony's intention to drop the flaming pliers into the fuel tank may well have worked, but the bullet that splattered his brains all over the garage forecourt had stopped him. There was no explosion and nothing to stop Wayne's legs from being taken from under him and his screaming body dragged into the thick fog. The screaming stopped, and the night was silent but for the disturbing rattle of death. Norman Black unclipped the thermal imager from his high-powered M24 rifle and placed the pair into the Jeep.
Did you get it?
Harris inquired.
Nope, but I wasn't trying to.
So what the fuck did you shoot at then?
The thermal imager was the latest technology and made it possible to see through the fog at some distance. Black smiled.
Protecting your retirement fund, buddy. But you don't have to thank me.
Harris shook his head in disbelief. This man was a douche, and Harris despised him, but he knew he'd have the last laugh. Black jumped into the Jeep, and Harris fired the engine up. From the outside, the Alfonso residence looked ominous. A broken fence, shattered patio doors, and a trail of blood. Ray had a strange sense of foreboding as he viewed the carnage, and his stomach churned. What the hell was going on? He muttered under his breath as he negotiated the debris, making his way into the house. The circle of white light from the torch probed the scene of devastation. Ray edged his way through the patio doors and scanned the wreckage. As the light fell on the bloodied, naked foot, a feminine foot, Ray froze. He could tell from the white bone and shredded skin that had been ripped away from the leg. Ray stood like stone, incredulous. In all his years, he had seen a lot of disturbing things, but never, ever like this. He swore under his breath and continued his search. A look of satisfaction drifted over Norman Black's features as he stood over his handiwork. Tony's lifeless body, the back of his head, splattered along the concrete forecourt.
What the hell's wrong with you, man? We're supposed to be protecting these people.
Harris said angrily.
Fuck you, Harris.
You got serious issues, you know that.
He was about to torch the whole goddamn gas station, man. He'd have fucked our mission and made a firestorm that would have alerted every emergency service within 30 miles.
Yeah. It's just an excuse to practice your macho bullshit.
Fuck you, Harris.
Yeah, whatever.
Harris stalked off back to the Jeep.
Let's just find the fucking thing. It can't be far.
Black checked his motion tracker and jogged back to the Jeep. Inside the kitchen of the main care home building, Keely busied herself making coffee. Her anxiety had not reduced at all, even with Jody's attempts at small talk.
How many residents have you got?
Keely was struggling to concentrate.
12, 6 in sheltered accommodation, 3 that need constant one-to-one care, and 3 that...
Keely stopped. The eerie rattling had returned again. This time it appeared to be louder, almost as if it was in the grounds close by.
There it is again.
She said.
What on earth is that?
The edginess was clearly evident in her voice. Jody, deeply unnerved herself, tried to play it down.
It's probably just the wind.
But there is no wind tonight. It's a really still night.
Jody looked at the clock on the wall.
Ray's taking his time.
Where is it coming from, can you tell?
Keely peered through the window into the care home compound. Jody took her torch from her utility belt.
I might take a look if it'd put you at ease.
No, that's okay. Like you said, it's probably just nothing.
She was unconvincing, and even Jody was starting to feel on edge. There was something very strange happening, and the uneasiness, paranoia, and panic have a way of spreading like a virus. Keely continued to gaze through the window into the shroud of thick fog. If anything, it was appearing to be getting worse. She suddenly gave a short, sharp intake of breath and involuntarily jumped back from the window.
What is it?
Asked Jody.
I thought I saw something.
Jody gently opened the sash window and shone her torch into the gloom. They both moved closer to the opening. The rattle was more prominent, intense even, with nothing to dull the sound.
Was that wise?
Queried Keely, referring to the open window.
Don't be silly.
From out of nowhere, a figure appeared at the window. Both Jody and Keely let out yelps and shot back in shock. The window slamming shut due to Jody's instant reaction to let go. Keely tried to steady herself as Jody let out a little laugh of relief.
It's only an old woman in her nightie.
It's Dorothy,
Giggled Keely. Keely opened the window and Dorothy, aged 82, peered through the window from the compound with a dazed, confused expression.
What are you doing wandering around at this time of night, Dorothy?
I can't sleep.
She replied in a cold, matter-of-fact way. Jody smiled. Poor old girl, she mused to herself. Keely tried to reassure her.
Why's that, Dot? Do you need a PRN?
It woke me and I can't get back to sleep.
What woke you, Dot?
The old lady could not have replied, even if she had wanted to. In the blink of an eye, she was swept away by something big, hostile, and powerful, its mandibles ripping, Dorothy in half as it reared up at the window. Keely and Jody reeled back in pure horror. Harris hammered the Jeep up the secluded driveway of the care home and spun it to an abrupt halt, sending gravel flying. Black, tranquilizer rifle in one hand, motion tracker in the other, climbed out of the Jeep. He handed the motion tracker to Harris.
Where's the pheromone spray and tranquilizer darts?
Said Black. Harris handed them to Black. Black looked at the spray for a moment.
Is this the right stuff?
Harris nodded.
Yeah.
Reassured, Black loaded a dart in the rifle. Harris aimed the motion tracker at the main house and climbed from the Jeep. He pointed through the fog to the front door of the house.
Tracker's pointing in there, big shot.
Keep close,
said Black as he edged towards the main door. Harris watched Black and smiled to himself. Not so cocky now. Are you asshole, he mused. Black paused at the main doors, took the pheromone spray and covered his jacket. He then opened the door carefully and eased his way in, rifle at the ready. He reached for the handle just as the double doors burst open, knocking Black off balance. It was Jody, and she was in a hurry. She exited the house at a run as Keely's screams filled the night air from inside. Harris grabbed her. She was in a sheer state of terror.
Okay, calm down. Where is it?
Jody's mind was racing, and she was in shock and struggling to comprehend events.
What?
She spluttered. Black steadied himself, sprayed some pheromones.
I'm going in,
He said as he disappeared through the double doors.
Yeah, you go for it, big man.
He called as he turned to the distraught Jody.
You okay?
He said, but she could only sob in response. Black scanned the inside of the huge hallway in darkness, except for an emergency light at one end. Keely's screaming had stopped, but Black's nostrils filled with the rancid stench of death. Black was nervous now. He had experienced combat in the Middle East, but this was different. Harris watched the screen of the motion tracker as the bleep, signifying black, moved slowly. Jody stood shaking her head.
I've got to go.
You'll be okay now.
Reassured Harris. He smiled to try and soothe her nerves, but she was dumbstruck. Black slipped a dart into the tranquilizer rifle and edged his way into the kitchen. The badly mutilated body of what was left of Keely Alfonso lay on the floor. He slowly and quietly switched his two-way radio to speak, and he whispered,
Harris? Can you see it on the tracker?
He clicked off for a response. Nothing. He looked at his radio to check it working. The rattle, loud and clear, was permeating from the dining room just beyond the kitchen door. Black tensed. He whispered into the two-way radio again,
Harris.
But again, there was no response, no reassurance, no backup. The dining room door was slightly ajar, and Black wedged the rifle barrel between the door and the door frame, and gently, ever so gently, eased the door open further. The death rattle intensified, and even though Black had sprayed the pheromones on, he still felt more nervous than he'd been for a long time. His pulse was racing, and his hands were wet with sweat. He peered into the dark recesses of the dining room. Something moved, and Black instinctively fired the dart. It pinged off the far wall of the room, and Black cursed himself. He quickly withdrew from the dining room door and opened the bolt of the rifle to load another dart, but he was not quick enough. The mutation was on him, its mandibles crushing him like a huge organic vice. Black let out a piercing, chilling scream as his ribcage and internal organs were beginning to crack and burst under the severe pressure. He made one last effort to raise the rifle, but the pain was so intense he began to drift into unconsciousness as he felt something inside him burst. As Black's last scream reached the courtyard, Jody stared at Harris, a wry smile on his face.
Aren't you going to help him?
She stuttered, stunned at his reaction. Harris shook his head.
Some people reap what they sow.
Jody watched Harris with apprehension as he carefully loaded his tranquilizer pistol. If he could stand by as his colleague, his brother-in-arms, died so horrifically a few yards away, what chance? She, a person he did not know, someone he just met. She edged away from Harris and the house that still contained it. Harris did not notice as she converged into the wooded area in front of the house. Harris viewed the motion tracker. The mutation was now just the other side of the home's double doors. He doused himself with the real pheromones and held the pistol in preparation, ignoring a bead of sweat that rolled down his cheek. In his complacency, he had seriously underestimated the speed and hostility of the mutation as it burst through the double doors. Harris was thrown to the floor, the force propelling the tranquilizer pistol onto the gravel drive in the process. The mutation sensed the pheromones on Harris and only momentarily paused before the appetizing odor of the departing policewoman caught its attention. Within seconds, it was in pursuit. Jody was desperately trying to move as quickly as she could through the thick undergrowth towards the road and hopefully safety. Each vine seemingly grabbed at her legs and feet, slowing her down. What she had witnessed had not fully processed. She was still in a state of disbelief, shock even, and the mist still hung like a cloak, almost as if it was purposely covering her escape route. She kept going, just like in her training, when everyone had written off her ability to achieve. She had found something in her inner resolve to keep going. She was just hoping and praying whatever it was not following her. Running almost blind, she missed the short, knee-high wire fencing that surrounded the care home grounds and tripped, flying headfirst down a small incline and onto the hard tarmac road with a thud, scraping the skin off her knee. She ignored the pain and dragged herself to her feet all the time, trying to scan the wooded area for signs of the abomination. Her chest ached with a combination of panic Anxiety and breathlessness, the cold air hurting her lungs. Jody held her breath for a moment as she listened. The faint sound of a distant car made up her mind which way to go, but she knew if she ran with the visibility as poor as it was, she risked being hit by a car, not being able to stop in time. But if she didn't run, IT might catch her. She decided to risk being hit by the car and hoping the car would stop in time. She began to run down the middle of the road away from the care home. She could hear the car getting closer, and from the sound of the engine it was, if anything, going a little too fast for the conditions. Still better to be hit than, well, the other option did not bear thinking about. Just then, the eerie, ominous rattling sounded somewhere behind her. Wherever it was too close. Jody picked up her pace. The car was nearing. She took off her fluorescent waistcoat and stood on the opposite side of the road, waving it at arm's length. Ray was speeding, and he knew it was a risk, but the devastation he had just witnessed at the Alfonso place was something he had never seen before in his life. Just then he saw the fluorescent waistcoat waving by the side of the road, and he slammed on the brakes and screeched to a halt. Jody appeared at the window, and Ray shouted,
"Get in!"
As if Jody had needed prompting, she flung herself in the car, and Ray gunned the accelerator.
I never thought I'd be so glad to see you,
she said breathlessly.
Should have called this in like you said,
he replied. The confusion in Ray's mind was only matched by the panic, as the car did not move, but momentarily lifted in the air and with an almighty crunch rolled onto its side into the ditch, the running parallel to the road. Jody screamed. Ray tried to process his mind what just happened, but the car again was lifted in the air and smacked roof down into the ditch. Jody sobbed. Ray didn't react. A wooden post attached to a fence next to the ditch had spliced through the car roof and cracked his head open. Blood was streaming from his head, and Jody couldn't tell if he was dead or unconscious. She had mild concussion, but was still conscious. Groggily and dazed, she felt her swollen, sore, bloodied nose. She winced, not quite sure where she was. The rattle of the genetic mutation was palpable, and the car door being ripped off its hinges quickly brought her to her senses. The chill and feeling of hopelessness coursed through her bones as the mutation ripped some of the car frame away, trying desperately to get to her. Mandibles tensed, the rattle intense, the intention obvious. Jody closed her eyes to await the inevitable. Bracing herself, the nerve-shredding rattling stopped suddenly. Now there was just silence. The mutation was slumped motionless against the side of the police car. Jody opened her eyes. Jensen peered through the front passenger window.
You okay?
He said. Jody, overwhelmed by a combination of relief and shock, sobbed, unsure what to think.
Don't worry, I'll get you out.
Harris pushed the head of the mutation with the heel of his boot, just enough to help Jody extricate herself from the upturned car. Grabbing a two-way radio, he clicked the communication button.
It's done. Just follow the signal over.
A voice on the other end offered a quick, "Will do," and the radio clicked off. Jody was sore and still a little dazed as she rubbed her head and moved away from the putrid-smelling mutation into the cool night air. Staggering to the roadside, she crumpled on the grass verge. Harris studied the girl for a moment and called to her.
I'll be back in a moment,
he said, disappearing into the fog. Jody veered from anxiety-ridden, trembling to dazed confusion as Harris returned with a blanket, some painkillers, and lukewarm coffee from a flask. He draped the blanket over her shoulders, and Jody swallowed the tablets with a swig of coffee. The faint rumble of a truck in the distance made Jody nervous. Harris reassured her, and lantern in hand, jumped into action as the two heavy diesel vehicles and a military ambulance emerged through the mist and braked noisily to a standstill. As the first truck reached Harris's Jeep, A man jumped out. It was Daniel Kidd. He slapped Harris on the shoulder.
You got it? Good work.
Harris nodded and forced a glimmer of a smile. He still did not trust Kidd.
You know you did the right thing, Jensen.
Kidd signaled to the truck, and 2 men in overalls got out. For the first time, Kidd noticed Jody sitting on the verge.
Who the hell is that?
Kidd said,
Local law enforcement.
Seriously?
There is a dead one in the car over there.
This came as a surprise to Kidd and an annoyance, but it wouldn't prove a problem. He mused himself. The forms of communication in the area were still either scrambled or blocked, except for his, so any backup would not be forthcoming.
How long before the tranquilizer wears off?
Harris shrugged.
Well, ballpark approximate?
Harris shrugged again. Kidd nodded.
Better not waste any time then.
Kidd put his arm around Harris's shoulder.
I bet you could use a cup of tea, couldn't you, young man?
Kidd pointed to the figure of Jody at the verge.
I'll get one for her too.
Jody looked up on the mention of her name, but she did not react, just gazed into space. Kidd whispered to Harris,
She saw the ear. It was in the process of ripping her apart when I sedated it.
Kidd nodded.
Okay, not a problem.
He grabbed a 2-way walkie-talkie from his suit pocket.
Get up here now.
The military-style ambulance crept out of the convoy and past the first truck. It reversed up and the back doors opened. The driver leapt from the ambulance at Kidd's nod and gently cajoled the distraught Jody from the grass verge and into the back of the ambulance.
Give her my specialty, Bob,
Kidd said. The ambulance driver nodded. Kidd smiled at Harris.
You know you did your country proud, Jensen, you know that?
I don't believe in selling my country out just for personal gain.
I agree,
grinned Kidd.
Schoonderbeck and Black were filled with greed, self-interest, and were scum. You did a great job. America loves a hero. Go get a brew, perk you up a little.
Harris nodded. He was tired, more tired than he had been since Afghanistan.
I prefer coffee.
Kidd winked at him.
Try my special blended tea. Promise you will not be disappointed.
Harris departed to the back of the awaiting ambulance with a pat on the back from Kidd. Kidd smiled smugly as the man in the overalls named Tom appeared at his shoulder. He was a big, bearded man in his 40s and was ex-military.
The goods are loaded for delivery, Daniel,
Tom said.
Good.
Kidd looked at his watch.
Give it a few minutes and we'll go straight to the meat.
Tom nodded. He was just about to leave when Kidd grabbed his arm.
I want all signs of our involvement removed and the story of a rogue loner gone crazy and going on a murder spree out here in the sticks circulated. Understand?
Tom nodded again.
I want you and the boys out of the country within 24 hours, and your money will be in an offshore account by midnight tomorrow. Okay?
Tom grinned as he nodded this time. Kidd smiled.
Good.
The ambulance driver jumped from the back of the ambulance and gave Kidd the thumbs up.
Out like a light, Dan.
Kidd had a wide grin.
One last job,
he said to Tom. Kidd and the ambulance driver proceeded to carry the drug-induced bodies of Jody and Harris from the back of the ambulance to the back of the first truck in the convoy. A side door was opened, and within a special compartment inside the truck, the comatose bodies were placed. Already in the back was a sedated body of Dr. Robert Schoonderbeck. Tom slammed the doors shut. Kidd acknowledged his workers and gave them the thumbs up.
Good work, lads. Go straight to the arranged meeting place. I'll see you there.
Drivers and loaders returned to their respective vehicles. Kidd hopped into the passenger seat of the ambulance, and the convoy sparked into life and moved off. Ponsonby Bay was a secluded, remote area in the northwest part of the Norfolk coast. Normally picturesque and always quiet, a lesser, more opaque mist hung over the jetty as a sunrise eased into another day. The convoy pulled into the port as a small ship waited in the harbour, equipped with a crane and some empty disguised containers. 4 well-dressed business people of differing cultural descent waited by the loading bay of the ship. Kidd exited the ambulance and walked towards the lead businesswoman, a tanned lady in her 50s dressed in a trouser suit and comfortable brogues named Nadia. Kid greeted her with a customary smile and a handshake.
Hello, Nadia.
Mr. Kidd.
She said, cold and aloof. She was often difficult to reach and a curse to cross.
Is the money ready to transfer as agreed?
Is the specimen and full research reports available as agreed?
Kid chuckled.
Of course.
Kid viewed Nadia and her business colleagues, a more miserable array of faceless nondescripts he could not remember. Nadia signaled to one of her colleagues to bring forward a laptop he had in his hand. Kid signaled for the lead truck to bring up the genetically modified merchandise and unload it ready for loading onto the ship. The rear of the truck was disconnected. The crane from the awaiting cargo ship swung into place and connected to container, and the loading commenced, all as Nadia signed in on the computer.
What about the necessary supplements?
Nadia said.
Yes, of course, as fresh as your ageless beauty, Nadia.
Nadia's colleague let out an unintentional laugh. Nadia turned and glared at him. Kid smiled.
I do not appreciate your English sense of humor, Mr. Kidd.
Kid smiled wryly.
The supplements are all arranged, ma'am.
Nadia glared at Kid this time.
Good. Are they live?
Of course, perfect for a carnivore,
grinned Kid. Jody awoke, her head racked with pain, piercing right down one side. Where the hell was she? What the hell happened? She desperately tried to make sense of the situation. Small air slots let through the dim light of the early morning, and she rubbed her eyes to adjust. Noticing the sedated bodies of Jensen Harris and a guy she'd never seen before lying next to her, she gingerly got to her feet and ran her hand over the heavy abattoir rubber curtain dividing the inside of the enclosed surroundings. She grabbed the curtain and yanked part of it to one side. The realization of her current situation slammed into her consciousness like a speeding train. Lying just a few feet away was the body of the genetically modified mutation. It too was sedated, but very, very real. Jody stumbled back away from it in sheer terror, and in desperation she tried to rouse Harris. He was still out cold. The panic began to set in, her head reeling. She started to bang and shout on the side of the metal container. The electronic transactions completed, Nadia turned the laptop in hand to show Kid. Kid nodded an okay. Nadia looked towards the first container, and as it was lowered onto the ship, the faint banging and shouting from inside made Nadia look at Kid quizzically.
When you said a fresh supply of protein and nourishment, you really did mean fresh.
I am the consummate professional Nadia, as you well know.
You are very thorough man, Mr. Kidd.
I like to think so,
he said, adjusting his tie. Nadia closed the laptop lid and handed it to one of her colleagues. The container locked into place on the ship. Nadia and Kid shook hands, deal done.
Thank you, Mr. Kidd.
My pleasure.
Nadia signaled to her colleagues and they began to reboard the ship. The drivers from the convoy all grouped together by the first truck watching as the ship hastily upped anchor with little fuss. Kid joined the men.
Remember boys out of the country within 24 hours or no money.
They all acknowledged him and began to disperse back to their trucks.
Good work, lads. I'll be in touch.
He called out to them. He watched as they all got into their respective vehicles, sparked their engines, and began to maneuver their way off the quay. Daniel turned and walked towards the opposite end of the quay, watching as Nadia's ship left the port. At the end of the quay sat a light cruiser, D-class. Kid boarded, climbed the ladder to the deck, and set the starter panel into operation.
All done?
A relaxed voice emanated from below.
Signed, sealed, and delivered.
He grinned. Dr. Sarah Dana emerged from the living quarters and joined him on deck, smiling. They kissed.
Sounds good,
she said.
Everything taken care of?
He mulled over the question, going through all the details and all the possible scenarios and equations. He nodded smugly.
Yes, I think so.
Sarah popped a small bag of cocaine from her pocket.
Nice day's work, Mr. Kidd.
Yes, most lucrative.
He smiled as he stroked the back of her neck.
The escaped madman on the rampage story circulated. All exposed humans either dead or dealt with, and 100 million in our account.
Very nice day's work.
They kissed again. He kissed her neck. She giggled with pleasure.
Only because you're a fucking genius, Dr. Dana.
She giggled again.
No trace at all?
No, not one.
He grinned. The fog was beginning to lift from the quiet countryside in the cold light of the winter's dawn. Running feet pounded the country fields, squelching through mud, vegetation, and over meadows. His breathing was labored and monotonous and driven by terror. Ryan Alfonso had ran when his sister had told him to, and he was still running. Where to, he didn't care, away from it and all that it had done. Would anyone ever believe him if he ever told?